The year was 1943. The war, officially, was still being won. Propaganda posters plastered across Berlin showed the triumphant, granite face of the Reich, but inside the sealed, dust-choked offices of Design Bureau 734, an ostensibly bland branch of the Reich Patent Office buried 3 floors beneath the nondescript government building, the lie was suffocatingly thin. Here, surrounded by blueprints for better mortar shells and theoretical designs for self-sealing fuel tanks, worked Dr. Elias Vogel. Elias was not a man built for the grim, angular precision of the Reich. He was a scientist, first and foremost, whose mind thrived on chaotic, beautiful equations, the kind that solved problems for humanity, not just for conquest. Now, his days were spent performing the intellectual equivalent of grinding sand into glass, slow, repetitive, and ultimately destructive work. Beside him, often sharing a cigarette stub and an exchange of weary glances, sat Dr. Klaus Richter. Klaus was the pragmatist, the engineer who could transform Elias's abstract calculations into something physically buildable. Where Elias was the dreamer haunted by ethics, Klaus was the anchor, burdened by the terrible necessity of survival. He had a wife and 2 young children hidden away on a small farm near Dresden. Every weld, every design compromise, every moment of silence in the office was a calculation of their continued breathing. They knew the truth. The German military machine wasn't just stalling, it was grinding itself into rust. Fuel was gone, competent pilots were gone, and the skies over the industrial heartland were increasingly crowded with enemy bombers. The only thing they still had in terrifying abundance was Hitler's delusion. The arrival of the Wunderwaffe decree. The decree arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by an SS Sturmbannführer named Major Werner Hess, a man whose eyes seemed perpetually cold, reflecting only the harsh fluorescent light of the basement. Hess didn't knock. He simply had the twin steel doors of the vault-like office thrown open, letting in a gust of stale official air and the smell of expensive, boot-polished leather. Hess was flanked by 2 heavily armed guards who positioned themselves at the entrance, ensuring that the usual low hum of activity in Bureau 734 died instantly. Dr. Vogel, Dr. Richter. Hess's voice was a low, guttural rasp, utterly devoid of inflection. A new directive from the Führer's chancellery. Hess did not offer the decree. He slapped a sealed, crimson folder onto Klaus Richter's drafting table. The sound echoed in the sudden silence. The paper was so thick it felt like leather, and the seal, the personal emblem of the High Command, was impossibly large. This is Project Thor's Hammer. The Führer himself has conceived of it. It is to be the single decisive weapon that breaks the deadlock in the East and ensures the integrity of the Reich until the final victory is secured. Elias Vogel felt a knot tighten in his chest, a sensation he knew intimately, the sickening certainty that what was coming would require him to do something morally unforgivable. He glanced at Klaus, whose face was a mask of practiced neutrality. Hess continued, leaning close enough that his breath smelled faintly of peppermint and metal. This project is now level 0 security. That means no communication outside this room, no paperwork that is not personally initialed by me, and absolutely no questions regarding its feasibility or timeline. Your authorization is the word of the Führer. Your deadline is impossible. Your objective is to achieve the impossible. He then delivered the final, chilling edict. You will build it. Refusal to comply, or perceived slowing of progress, will be treated as high treason. You know the consequence of that, doctors. He nodded toward the waiting guards. Immediate execution. No trial. With that, Hess gave a precise, sharp heel click, retrieved his guards, and exited, leaving behind only the crimson folder and a vacuum of suffocating fear. The weapon's insane demands. For an hour, neither engineer moved. The rhythmic thud-thud-thud of distant Allied bombing practice became the only sound. Finally, Klaus reached out and broke the seal, tearing the thick parchment with a brittle sound. Elias leaned in, his glasses magnifying the handwritten notes and the complex, chaotic diagrams inside. It took only 5 minutes of reading for the blood to drain from Elias's face. My God, Klaus, Elias whispered, the words catching in his throat. It's a joke. Klaus scanned the power requirements, the proposed material list, and the theoretical physics sketched in hurried, manic strokes. He, too, felt the professional revulsion, the utter disdain a true engineer holds for something fundamentally, irrevocably wrong. The Thor's Hammer was a proposed thermobaric energy delivery system, a massive, truck-mounted device designed to generate a localized, high-density magnetic field that would then trigger an artificial, contained plasma cascade, vaporizing everything within a kilometer radius. But the required specifications were not merely ambitious, they were scientifically delusional. Power output. The device demanded a sustained energy discharge equivalent to the output of a medium-sized power station, condensed into a 20-second burst. They had barely enough copper wiring to run the lights in the lab. Containment. It required a superconducting alloy with specific isotopic qualities that simply did not exist in 1943. The design called for materials that were, at best, decades away from discovery. Size and mobility. Despite the immense power, the entire assembly was required to be mobile, mountable on a standard Wehrmacht heavy transport vehicle. The power core, Elias muttered, jabbing a finger at a frantic sketch of a coil. He wants a self-sustaining magnetic flywheel made of aluminum and scavenged iron. It would tear itself apart before it hit 5% capacity. It would be a bomb, Klaus, but an uncontrolled one, likely exploding in our faces during the first bench test. Klaus pushed his glasses up, rubbing his tired eyes. The deadline, Elias, 6 months for a working prototype. That's not a deadline, it's a death sentence. He knows we can't do it, but he needs the belief, the illusion, that it's possible. The silent choice. The reality was crushing. If they told the truth, that the science was flawed, the materials were impossible, and the design was suicidal, they would be shot for insubordination and defeatism. If they tried to build it honestly, they would fail anyway, and the delay, the cost, and the inevitable collapse would still lead to their execution. They were trapped in a classic Nazi double bind. Elias leaned back, running a trembling hand through his thinning hair. We can't build this, Klaus. If we manage to pull off even a fraction of the power output he demands, and the thing works, he will have his wonder weapon. It might not win the war, but it will prolong it. It will slaughter thousands more. Klaus looked at the crimson folder, then at the steel door. He looked past the door to the image of his wife and children. Survival demanded compliance. Ethics demanded resistance. He took a slow, deep breath, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. We won't build it, Elias. Elias looked up, a flicker of startled hope and raw terror in his eyes. What, you mean, we tell Hess? No, no, Klaus cut him off, his voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper, forcing Elias to lean in. We build the illusion of it. We build it so slowly, so perfectly incorrectly, that it must fail. We stall. We divert the critical resources. We introduce flaws that look like common engineering mistakes, but are fatal to the operation. The plan was a silent pact, instantly understood, terrifyingly embraced. They were engineers. Their job was to make things work. Now, their mission was to make this particular thing not work. They had to invent, design, and manufacture spectacular failure, a failure that looked like bad luck, material defects, or the inherent difficulty of the project, not deliberate sabotage. Sabotage, Elias whispered, the word feeling enormous in the small, silent office. Klaus nodded once, grimly. We are sabotaging the effort, Elias. But we are saving ourselves, and perhaps, accidentally, we are saving the world from the most lethal version of this war. We have orders to build a weapon. Our real mission is to build a dud, a convincing piece of junk that consumes enough time and resources to run out the clock on the war. He spread the schematics out on the desk. Right, Thor's hammer needs an impossible containment field. Let's make sure we order the wrong grade of nickel chrome for the prototype. It'll look like a requisition error, but when the power runs, the whole thing will melt. Let's start with that. We begin the stall now. They did not shake hands. They did not speak another word about the choice. They simply picked up their instruments, and two brilliant engineers, tasked with building a weapon of mass destruction, began their quiet, high-stakes work of systematic, deliberate failure. The hours after Major Hess's chilling departure blurred into a haze of frantic whispered planning for Dr. Elias Vogel and Dr. Klaus Richter. They hunched over the schematics for Project Thor's hammer, grimly nicknamed Fenris, the mythic wolf fated to devour the world. The blueprints, signed off by a string of high-ranking officers who understood nothing of applied physics, looked less like engineering drawings and more like fevered acts of will. Every detail was scientifically impossible, a testament to Hitler's growing detachment from reality. Klaus, the structural specialist, buried his face in the reactor chamber diagram. Look at this, Elias. The central reactor. They've designed an impulsive plasma ignition using scavenged heavy water. The temperatures during the pulse are conservatively estimated at 3000 degrees Celsius. Elias, the theoretician, shuddered. And the chamber material, ordinary steel with a thin refractory coating. That coating won't last a millisecond. The central mechanism would simply vaporize. The prototype would turn into a local metal shrapnel bomb. It wouldn't annihilate the enemy, it would annihilate the crew. But the most damning requirement concerned the power source. To create the magnetic field, the weapon's core feature, the Fenris project called for a singularity capacitor array. On paper it appeared as a series of massive spinning copper flywheels, charged by industrial transformers to store energy and then release it in a single catastrophic burst. The rotational speed required for that charge density is absurd, Elias calculated, scribbling notes and double-checking his work. The centrifugal forces on the flywheels would exceed the tensile strength of any steel alloy available. At peak charge the whole assembly would fragment violently. It's a guaranteed catastrophic mechanical failure. And yet failure was their mission. Their job was to manufacture that failure while appearing to work in good faith. The scarcity of materials and impossible deadlines of 1943 became their greatest ally. The demands of the Eastern Front, the bombing campaigns, and broken supply lines meant obtaining specialized, high-grade components was practically impossible. Fenris was elevated to the highest industrial priority, but priority doesn't conjure tungsten or crystalline copper out of thin air. Major Hess's directive was brutal. Complete and live field test within 6 months. 6 months to design, procure components, build, and bench test a device that contradicts 3 laws of thermodynamics, Klaus muttered, staring into the distance. That gives us exactly 6 weeks to acquire parts before Hess starts demanding assembly updates. That timeframe gave them their first, crucial opportunity for sabotage. Sabotage Tactic 1. The Material Mirage. The opening move was the formal requisition of materials. They needed to order something that would look correct to SS auditors but prove catastrophic in assembly. Klaus took charge of the critical alloy for the plasma focusing lens, a high-purity molybdenum rhenium alloy known for its heat tolerance. Germany produced it only in trace amounts. Almost everything was already earmarked for U-boat turbine blades. Klaus meticulously drafted the requisition, but he slipped in a subtle error in the component code. Instead of specifying the high-temperature MO47 RE3 standard, I listed MO47 crossing 3, he explained to Elias. Chromium makes the alloy easier to machine, so suppliers will prioritize it because it's available. But chromium contamination lowers the melting point by nearly 300 degrees. So when the lens is finished, Elias realized, it will look right to the auditors and pass non-destructive stress tests. But at the moment of the plasma pulse, it will warp, crack, and fail to focus the field. Klaus finished, feeling a cold mix of triumph and dread. A total operational failure, recorded as unanticipated thermal stresses due to material variability. Sabotage cloaked as engineering reality. Sabotage Tactic 2. The documentation deadlock. Elias took control of the theoretical calculations and documentation. To a non-engineer these pages were dense and boring, the perfect place to hide traps. Hitler demanded unrealistic power outputs. To make the numbers look impressive on paper, Elias introduced mathematically plausible errors. He focused on the inductance factor of the primary coils, the conversion between coil current and the resulting magnetic energy. He deliberately used an outdated inductance model that did not account for the specific geometry they'd been forced to use. The theoretical output we'll present to Hess will be astronomical, Elias whispered, pointing to pages full of Greek letters and heavy integrals. But the assembly diagrams the technicians will follow rely on the flawed inductance. Built to those specs, the coils will generate only 7% of the theoretical power. Enough to show something is happening, but nowhere near enough to weaponize. The documents were thick and authoritative. No general or SS officer would spend the hours required to audit the differential equations. The flaw was buried deep in the theory itself. The unspoken pressure. The project became a masterclass in controlled delay. They staged loud, heated arguments over trivial design details, loud enough that any hidden microphones would register the conflict. They produced meticulous reports about difficulties sourcing, pure graphite shielding, and unusual bearing wear. Every move was calculated, every delay intentional. Still, the pressure only intensified. Hess began visiting daily, not merely to collect reports but to stand and watch. He would stand silently by the drafting table, his shadow stretching across their schematics. Hess keeps reminding us the Führer expects results, not excuses, Klaus reported grimly after one visit. He asked why we've spent 2 days finalizing the cooling system when the core hasn't even been ordered. What did you tell him? Elias asked, biting his lip. That an engineer who neglects cooling for a complex system dooms his work, Klaus replied. He stared at me and said, failure is not an option, doctor. Only execution is an option. The irony was suffocating. They risked execution by deliberately engineering failure. Fear surrounded them. Fear of Allied bombs, fear of Hess's silent surveillance, and the paralyzing fear that their intricate plan would either be uncovered too soon or, worse, that some part of it might accidentally work. They understood the stakes. Their objective was neither victory nor mere survival. Their task was the most dangerous of all: to consume resources, buy time, and ensure that this world-changing weapon remained a convincingly useless, resource-devouring heap. ChatGPT Skazel, the unblinking eye of Major Hess. The basement offices of Design Bureau 734 had stopped feeling like a place of work and had become a cage under perpetual observation. Major Werner Hess was not merely a security officer, he was a living instrument of psychological warfare, intended to drain the focus and courage from every mind he supervised. He spent November 1943 holed up in the little glass observation room beside the main drafting floor. He never raised his voice, never made overt threats, but his presence was a constant, suffocating weight. He read every report, signed every requisition slip, and watched Dr. Elias Vogel and Dr. Klaus Richter through the pain, hands clasped behind his back, a mask of clinical, lethal patience fixed to his face. That relentless scrutiny was the toughest obstacle to their sabotage. Delays could not come from obvious inaction, they had to be manufactured through hyper-competent error. Every mistake had to be defensible inside the impossible logic of the Fenris project itself. The sabotage escalates. The mistakes begin. Klaus and Elias settled into a grim rhythm, weaving failures into the project like poison threads. The capacitor coil confusion altered blueprints. The single largest component of Thor's hammer was the singularity capacitor array, massive copper coils that would store huge amounts of energy. Elias's corrupted inductance figures had already undermined the theory. Klaus now sabotaged the construction drawings. He inserted a unit conversion error in a single critical dimension, the diameter of the primary copper conduits. Instead of standard millimeters, he specified the measurement in an obscure Prussian unit, off by only a fraction of a millimeter. That tiny difference, spread across 2-meter coils, reduced internal space enough to marginally restrict oil cooling channels. The result? To casual inspection the coils looked correct, but at peak load the restricted flow would produce hotspots, causing thermal breakdown and spectacular insulation failure during testing. Klaus buried the justification in a 20-page addendum about sourcing copper from a specific military depot, and Hess, swamped by paper, merely initialed it. Time lost. 5 weeks. The scavenger hunt for wrong components. The neutron trigger shielding called for a rare, custom graphite composite. Exploiting wartime scarcity, Elias routed the order through a convoluted requisition channel that sent it to a bombed factory operating at a fraction of capacity. When the factory finally replied, 6 weeks later, they could only supply an inferior boron carbide composite. Hess, furious at the delay, ordered them to accept the substitute. Elias complied with a bowed head and immediate design adjustments. In truth, boron carbide would do the job of shielding, but its high neutron capture properties would render the component dangerously radioactive during test firing, contaminating the chamber and making further operation and analysis impossible. Elias presented the swap as a wartime compromise and framed Hess's decision as decisive problem-solving. Time lost. Weeks for the wrong part, plus future delays for decontamination. The near miss. The integrity audit. By January 1944 the project had consumed enormous, specialized resources and drawn unwanted attention. Obersturmbannführer Dr. Anton Zeller, a ruthless physics auditor from the Army Ordnance Office, arrived unannounced and demanded to see the theoretical foundations, every equation. For 48 hours he worked in the isolation room beside Hess, and for 48 hours Elias and Klaus counted the seconds. On the third morning Zeller called Elias in and slammed the calculations on the table. He had noticed an approximation error in the inductance model that would reduce the array's power by 7%. Elias felt the floor drop beneath him. Zeller had found the flaw, but he did not suspect malice, he saw only a human error. Elias reacted fast. He feigned panic and shame, blamed a transcription slip, then turned the conversation to the real material compromises, boron carbide, supply shortages, management failures. He painted the 7% drop as a minor, fixable oversight and the substituted shielding as the real, urgent threat. Zeller, distracted by documented material problems and Hess's poor logistics, accepted the explanation and ordered corrections. He left convinced the project suffered from bureaucracy and shortage, not sabotage. The near miss tightened the engineers' resolve. They were playing a deadly, mathematical chess game with the Reich. Subversion Tactic 3. The endless test cycle. With components arranged and intentionally flawed, construction began. Klaus controlled the assembly and introduced the final, most effective delay, the endless test cycle. For the entire month of February he ran elaborate, non-essential, operational readiness, tests on the transport chassis, simulated vibration analyses, engines run for hours, reams of pointless data collected. The tests consumed scarce fuel and work hours and looked exactly like prudent engineering. Klaus argued that a catastrophic road failure prior to a public demonstration would be a far worse humiliation for the Führer than a delay. Hess could not publicly contest a claim for safety and professionalism, however furious he was. By the time a low-power pre-test finally arrived in late March, 5 months had passed. The High Command, desperate for a Wunderwaffe, had pushed the schedule forward, so the final demonstration was set for early April, a terrifyingly tight window that left no room for error or any further subtle sabotage. The ticking clock. Fenris was now a loaded mechanism with 3 built-in, engineered failures: the missiloid containment vessel guaranteeing a meltdown, the incorrectly wound coils guaranteeing insulation failure and negligible power, and the substituted shielding guaranteeing immediate self-contamination. The engineers had done everything they could. The fate of the project, and their lives, now rested on the inevitable, spectacular failure of their creation. The Day of Reckoning, April 7, 1944. The air was cold, crisp, and heavy with the dread of 1,000 potential outcomes. The demonstration site was a heavily secured, desolate testing range nestled deep in the forests of Brandenburg, hastily cleared for the occasion. The target was a cluster of derelict Polish TKS tankets, positioned 900 meters from the Fenris prototype. The prototype itself, mounted on a hulking, military green flatbed truck, was an ugly spectacle. Its massive copper capacitor coils, wound with the subtly flawed wire, shimmered under the pale morning sun. The containment vessel, secretly forged with the wrong chromium alloy, sat at the heart of the apparatus, a ticking time bomb of metallurgical weakness. Dr. Elias Vogel and Dr. Klaus Richter stood beside the operational control trailer, their uniforms freshly pressed, their faces pale and drawn. They were flanked by a phalanx of security: Major Hess, radiating an aura of lethal anticipation, and several anonymous SS officers. But the audience was the real source of terror. Watching from a reinforced observation bunker were Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, sent to represent Hitler's direct interest, the Minister of Armaments Albert Speer, and numerous high-ranking military and scientific officials, all desperate for a miracle. "The time for delay is over, doctors," Major Hess whispered, leaning in close to Klaus. "The Reich requires assurance. If the demonstration is a success, you are heroes. If it is merely a failure, you will be deemed time wasters. If it is deemed sabotage." He let the sentence hang, implying the brutal consequence. Klaus, his heart hammering against his ribs, nodded stiffly. He looked at Elias, and in that exchange, the final, unspoken check was made. Were all the flaws in place? Yes. Was the failure guaranteed? Almost certainly. The power up. A symphony of inefficiency. The plan was simple. The failure had to be convincing, loud, and technically confusing. It could not be silent. That would imply simple inaction. It had to actuate just enough to prove the underlying theory had potential, but fail spectacularly and irreversibly before achieving any dangerous result. Klaus manned the primary console, a panel of blinking, oversized dials and switches. Elias was positioned at the power monitoring station, where he would observe the fatal thermal dynamics. Fenris Project, initiating charge sequence, Klaus announced, his voice amplified across the desolate range. He threw the main engagement switch. A deafening, mechanical whine began as the massive flywheels of the singularity capacitor array spun up. The faulty inductance calculation immediately came into play. The enormous input of electrical current resulted in a disappointingly low output on the energy storage meters. Report. Goring's voice crackled, distorted by the trialer's external speaker. Charging proceeding according to predicted curve, Reichsmarschall. Elias lied smoothly, reading from the theoretical prediction charts, not the actual, suppressed readings. Initial power saturation at 40%. In reality, the output was barely reaching 3% of the theoretical requirement. As the rotation speed increased, the copper coils began their silent, fatal countdown. The tiny error in the winding diameter, the few tenths of a millimeter difference due to the historical unit conversion, restricted the flow of the vital mineral oil coolant. The clock was now running on the material mirage and the documentation deadlock. The first failure, the coil meltdown, at what Elias claimed was 75% power saturation, in reality, barely 5%, the first flaw asserted itself. The localized hotspots created by the restricted coolant reached critical temperature. A sharp, acrid scent, hot enamel and burning oil, wafted into the control trailer. On the main console, a cascade of warning lights, which Klaus had deliberately wired with cheap, sensitive fuses, suddenly exploded into life. Primary coil array, thermal breach. Klaus shouted, making his voice sound strained and professional. Insulation failure in segments 4 through 9. Immediate safety shutdown required. He slammed the emergency release button. The whining roar of the flywheels began a slow, grinding deceleration. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of rapid, heavy footsteps approaching the trailer. Major Hess burst through the door, his face a mask of furious disappointment. "What in God's name was that, Dr. Richter?" Hess demanded, gesturing wildly toward the prototype, from which thin tendrils of smoke were now rising. Klaus maintained his rigid composure. "Major, this is precisely the type of failure we warned about. Unanticipated thermal stresses. We have saturated the core at 75% capacity, but the insulation varnish has failed. This is a material science failure, not a design failure." "Material science," Hess spat. "You have had unlimited priority. And we used every component available, Major," Elias intervened, stepping forward with a stack of requisition forms that detailed the difficulty in sourcing high-grade varnish. "We believe the insulation was contaminated during transit. A clear indication of the desperate state of our supply chain. We could not proceed to full power without risking a complete structural collapse of the weapon, rendering it useless." From the bunker, Goring's voice boomed, impatient and dangerous. "Was there a measurable magnetic field?" "Yes, Reichsmarschall," Klaus confirmed instantly. "A successful, localized field was generated. The fundamental theory is sound. The problem is entirely one of component endurance. This was the core of their defense. The theory is brilliant, the implementation is cursed by wartime scarcity." This was a story the High Command wanted to believe. The decision to push, an act of calculated risk. Hess, under direct pressure, couldn't accept the premature shutdown. He stormed to the speaker. "Reichsmarschall," Hess reported, his voice tight. "The engineers report a minor insulation failure due to component quality. They believe the core is structurally intact. I recommend a secondary, immediate discharge at reduced capacity to demonstrate the field generation capability." Klaus and Elias exchanged a look of sheer horror. A second discharge. The heat stress from the first, even compromised, pulse would have already weakened the containment vessel, the one made of the wrong alloy, and the neutron shielding, the boron carbide. If they ran it again, the failure would be spectacular, and highly dangerous. "Very well," Goring conceded heavily. "Give the Führer a result, Major. A tangible effect, now." Hess turned to the engineers, his eyes shining with cold fanaticism. "You heard him. Engage, now. No excuses." Klaus saw his death approaching. If they refused, they were traitors. If they proceeded, The failure might be so violent it would be deemed a bomb, and they would be executed for incompetence if they survived the blast at all. There was only one path left. The final, most dangerous sabotage. Dr. Vogel, Klaus said, his voice clipped and precise. Bypass the main safety regulators. We must demonstrate stability under duress. Translation. Introduce the final, terminal failure mechanism now. Elias instantly understood. The boron carbide shielding was now hot, weakened, and accumulating neutron activity. They had to trigger the self-contamination before the containment vessel actually ruptured and killed them all. The catastrophic climax. Total system collapse. Klaus re-engaged the flywheels, forcing the damaged coils to charge again. The whine was higher, grating, the sound of strained metal about to give way. The thermal warnings were immediately in the red. Elias, with calculated speed, bypassed the final radiation dampeners, exposing the damaged boron carbide shielding to the nascent magnetic field pulse. Engaging discharge in 3, 2, 1. Klaus threw the discharge lever. There was a deafening crack. It was not the majestic, world-rending roar of a wonder weapon, but the violent, self-destructive spasm of a failed machine. The magnetic pulse activated, but only for a fraction of a second. Due to the compromised induction, the field was weak, sputtering, and deeply unstable. The power transfer failed almost immediately, but not before two crucial, engineered failures asserted themselves. Neutron shielding collapsed the wrong components. The momentary pulse was enough to heat the pre-stressed boron carbide shielding past its critical point. The shield did not explode, but it violently vented a cloud of dangerously radioactive steam and particles into the containment area. A spectacular mechanical failure, the wrong alloy. Simultaneously, the containment vessel, unable to handle even the reduced spike, did not melt, but violently buckled and fractured with a sound like a gunshot. The structural failure caused the entire energy delivery conduit to sever. The Fenris prototype, Thor's hammer, did not destroy the target tanks 900 meters away. It destroyed itself. The truck bed was instantly shrouded in a cloud of dense, foul-smelling smoke, laced with dangerously hot, radioactive particulates. Shrapnel, mostly from the cheap steel components Klaus had ordered for non-critical areas, rained down near the control trailer. The sound of the catastrophic failure was enough to shake the observation bunker. The immediate fallout. Silence descended again, but this time it was a terrified, profound silence. The officials in the bunker were shaken but unharmed. The engineers, covered in soot and sweat, stood rigid, awaiting their fate. Hess, his face white with shock and rage, slowly turned to face Klaus and Elias. The fury was palpable, but it was undercut by something else, fear. He had guaranteed success, and now he was standing next to a smoking, possibly radioactive wreck. What just happened? Whispered, his voice trembling for the first time. Total system collapse, Major, Elias reported calmly, gesturing toward the prototype. We had a chain reaction failure. The thermal stress from the first test created a microscopic weakness in the containment vessel. The second pulse, though small, leveraged that weakness, resulting in a structural fracture and a massive containment breach. Klaus added the most critical piece of disinformation. Major, the air around the prototype is now heavily contaminated by uncontrolled neutron activity. The device has destroyed itself and the site, rendering it impossible to approach for immediate analysis. It is a biological hazard. This final lie, the radioactive contamination, was brilliant. It prevented immediate, close-range inspection by other engineers who might discover the subtle alloy and wiring flaws and made the entire site unusable. The fateful debriefing. An hour later, Klaus and Elias were standing in the chilly observation bunker with Göring, Speer, and Hess. Göring, a man used to grand displays of power, was purple with frustrated rage. It failed, spectacularly, and it poisoned the site. Göring roared, slamming his fist onto a map table. The Führer wanted a weapon to change the war, not a steaming pile of useless scrap that kills its own operators. Albert Speer, the pragmatist, was more analytical. He was staring at the technical reports. Dr. Vogel, Speer said quietly, your initial reports warned us of the material shortages. You stated that the available materials could not withstand the required output. Was the design itself flawed, or was it entirely due to the materials? This was the moment. Their lives depended on the answer. Minister Speer, Elias replied, his voice firm and unwavering, the physics are sound. We proved the theory. The magnetic field was generated, however briefly. But we cannot fight a total war using parts sourced from a civilian scrapyard. The integrity of the containment field requires isotopically pure materials that the Reich simply cannot produce under current bombing raids. The weapon consumed itself because the material could not contain the power. Speer leaned back, nodding slowly. He was a logistics man. He understood resource failure. The failure was terrible, but it was justifiable within the brutal context of wartime material allocation. Hess, realizing his neck was also on the line, quickly jumped in to support the engineered failure. Reichsmarshal, the engineers pushed the device beyond its documented material limits, under my command. They acted with courage, not treachery. The failure is a direct result of the Allied bombing campaign starving our factories. This was the accidental miracle. Hitler's trust in the science was shaken. He did not blame the fundamental concept. That would mean admitting his own vision was wrong. He blamed the logistics and the material scarcity. The consequences were immediate, but not lethal for the engineers. Hitler raged. The Führer, upon receiving the report, flew into a terrifying rage, screaming about defeatist supply officers and sabotage from the logistics chain. The project was shelved. Speer, needing to conserve the final remaining stocks of copper and specialized alloys for actual, conventional military production, issued the final order. Project Fenris is suspended indefinitely. The resources are to be reallocated to aircraft production and conventional rocketry. Klaus and Elias were not shot. They were not even imprisoned. They were simply reassigned to a low-priority, theoretical research division in Munich, a forgotten corner of the crumbling Reich. They had been ordered to build a weapon that could have prolonged the war by months, costing millions of lives. Instead, they delivered a radioactive smoking wreck that consumed precious, critical resources and convinced the high command that the problem was the Reich's industry, not the Reich's ideology. They had stalled, they had sabotaged, and by creating the perfect failure, they had accidentally saved the world. The Gestapo's cold scrutiny, the indefinite suspension of Project Fenris was not the end of the engineers' ordeal, it was merely the beginning of the most dangerous phase, the Inquisition. Major Hess, desperate to save his career and his neck, had successfully redirected initial blame toward the supply chain, the defeatist factory managers who delivered compromised materials. But the Gestapo was never satisfied with simple material failure. When a project blessed by the Führer himself ends in a radioactive, smoking wreck that wastes critical resources, the only acceptable explanation is treachery. 10 days after the demonstration, 2 investigators arrived at the Munich Research Annex where Dr. Elias Vogel and Dr. Klaus Richter had been exiled. They were led by Hauptsturmführer Karl Seifert, a Gestapo officer specializing in intellectual sabotage, a man whose reputation was built on executing scientists who failed to deliver promised miracles. Seifert was methodical, cold, and utterly convinced of the engineers' guilt. He did not ask about the failure, he asked about the engineers' intentions. The interrogation room was stark, save for a single lamp illuminating only the face of the interrogated. Seifert worked Elias first, trying to find the emotional fracture point. Dr. Vogel, Seifert began, tapping a long, pale finger on Elias's initial induction calculations. You admitted an error in the inductance factor calculation during the audit. A 7% reduction in theoretical power. Why? Was this an honest mistake, or did you deliberately introduce an inefficiency into the core design? Elias had rehearsed this moment countless times in the long, sleepless nights. He invoked the paper shield Klaus had built, the mountain of legitimate-looking, compromised documents. Hauptsturmführer, Elias replied calmly, sounding weary but intellectually certain, my error was a moment of fatigue, yes. But it was corrected. The true problem lies here. He slid a copy of the metallurgy report, the one detailing the compromised material, across the table. The containment vessel, ordered under emergency priority, failed at 5.5% of its theoretical yield point. I could forgive a 7% loss in power. I cannot forgive a 100% loss of containment. He expertly shifted the focus from the small, corrected technical flaw, his deliberate error, to the massive, fatal material flaw, Klaus's deliberate error. Seifert spent 3 grueling days poring over the technical reports. He questioned Klaus for hours on the Zoll unit conversion that had restricted the cooling channels. Why? Dr. Richter, would you use an obsolete East Prussian unit of measurement in a modern, pan-German design? Seifert demanded. Klaus, the structural pragmatist, was ready. He cited a dozen internal Reich memos mandating the use of specific, available copper stock from a seized Polish depot. The copper wire stock, Hauptsturmführer, was fabricated on aging machinery set to historical standards mandated by the Reich. I was forced to design the winding housing around the physical constraints of the wire we were actually supplied, not the wire we theoretically desired. He had framed the sabotage as ingenious adaptation to the limitations of the Reich's dwindling resources. Hess, in his desperate final report, had already confirmed the material struggles. The perfect cover, technical miscalculation. The brilliance of their strategy lay in the complexity of the failure. An ordinary saboteur might have placed a bomb or severed a wire, simple acts of treason that are easily proven. Elias and Klaus had orchestrated a failure by overwhelming, legitimate complexity. The final report submitted by the engineers and grudgingly signed off on by Hess and Speer cited four primary, interlocking causes: metallurgical stress failure, the compromise in the Mo-Cr alloy for the containment vessel, Klaus's sabotage of the requisition, thermal insulation degradation, localized heat failure in the capacitor coils due to restricted coolant channels, Klaus's sabotage of the blueprints, radioactive contamination, self-destruction of the shielding material under duress, Elias's sabotage of the material substitution, extreme system complexity. The design itself was pushing the limits of known physics, leading to unpredictable failure chains. The truth, which masked the lies. On paper, every mistake looked like a consequence of wartime pressure meeting cutting-edge science. The engineers had not been traitors, they had been overzealous patriots who pushed flawed components too hard. Seifert found no evidence of intent, only evidence of incompetence born of overwork and bad supply. He was forced to conclude that while the engineers were certainly useless to the war effort, they were not technically traitors. The Gestapo report was filed under technical miscalculation, Project Fenris. The secret that nearly died. The engineers lived, reassigned to bureaucratic backwaters, safe but perpetually terrified. They never spoke of the sabotage, not even to each other, communicating only through veiled glances and shared, quiet relief. The silence became their heaviest burden. They had saved their lives, but they had to carry the knowledge of their secret act alone. The true cost of their resistance was the psychological isolation, the realization that they had done something heroic, yet could never claim it, never share it, and never be certain that the dark shadow of Major Hess, who had been disgraced but not executed, wouldn't eventually find a reason to reopen the case. It wasn't until the final collapse of the Third Reich in 1945, and the subsequent rush by Allied technical intelligence teams, Operation Paperclip, to seize German scientific assets, that the chilling potential of the Fenris project was truly understood. Among the salvaged documents were high-level theoretical projections authored by the project's lead physicist, Dr. Elias Vogel, projections written before the sabotage began, detailing the weapon's intended purpose. Allied scientists were initially baffled by the schematics for Thor's hammer. On its own, the weapon, an attempt at a localized thermobaric blast, was impractical and power-hungry. However, embedded deep within the initial theory were two chilling possibilities that proved the true danger of the project had it succeeded. The enabling factor: nuclear delivery. The Fenris project was designed to create an intense, highly focused magnetic field. Allied analysts realized that if the containment vessel had held and the power output been achieved, this magnetic field would have solved one of the key engineering hurdles in early nuclear weapons design: efficient, non-conventional delivery. If the magnetic field technology had been perfected, it could have served as accelerated fission seeding. The intense neutron flux created by the early, high-power plasma pulse could have acted as an accelerated, neutron seeding mechanism. Had the Nazis acquired enough U-235, a resource they never fully secured, the Fenris power system could have enabled a more efficient, less bulky detonation package years ahead of schedule. A clean delivery system for chemical agents. More immediately, the ability to generate a massive, directed field of contained energy would have provided a perfect means for disseminating vast quantities of nerve agents like Tabun or sarin, which Germany possessed in abundance across a wide area, bypassing conventional artillery delivery, which was often inaccurate or easily countered. Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, shown the fragments of the Fenris design, reportedly remarked, "The machine itself was a folly, but the enabling science within it was a pathway to true terror." Had they mastered that coil array, they would have shortened the nuclear timeline by a year, maybe more. The strategic cost of success. Further analysis revealed the terrifying strategic timeline that Richter and Vogel's failure had averted. Had Fenris succeeded in April 1944, resources diverted. The project would have immediately been expanded, diverting tens of thousands of workers, irreplaceable tons of copper, high-grade nickel, and specialized electrical components away from crucial defensive and conventional weapon production, like fighter jets, tank refurbishment, and anti-aircraft systems. Prolongation of the war. The mere threat of a deployed wonder weapon, even a localized one, would have drastically altered Allied strategic planning. It would have forced delays in the planned D-Day landings, June 1944, buying the Reich critical months to stabilize the Western Front and potentially completing other critical programs, such as the V-2 rocket program. Millions spared. The delays caused by the engineered failures of Richter and Vogel, the 9 months of endless testing, sourcing, and the final investigation, were 9 months during which the war proceeded toward its inevitable end. Those months were crucial. Every week of delay meant that copper was not successfully wired into a weapon of mass destruction, and every day meant the Allies moved closer to achieving air superiority and a successful foothold in Europe. The calculated failure had resulted in the enemy wasting massive amounts of energy and material, gaining nothing but a smoking wreck, and forcing Hitler to turn his attention elsewhere. Their failure had not just prevented a weapon from being built, it had prevented the systemic waste of resources that could have genuinely prolonged the conflict, potentially sparing millions of lives in the final, brutal campaigns of 1944 and 1945. The silent resistance of 2 engineers in a cold basement had an impact far greater than any open act of military heroism. The war's end and the unseen triumph. The war ended for Elias Vogel and Klaus Richter not with a bang, but with the weary signing of an armistice. They were in the forgotten Munich annex when the news broke in May 1945. They simply packed their bags and walked out, 2 utterly exhausted, middle-aged men with clean hands but burdened consciences. Klaus went back to Dresden to find his wife and children. They had survived. He never mentioned Fenris. He became a professor of civil engineering, focusing on building bridges and houses, structures that connected people, not annihilated them. Elias, the theoretical mind, emigrated to South America, unable to reconcile his guilt with the history of his actions. He worked anonymously for a small university, continuing his pure research, forever haunted by the math of what could have been. The Allied discovery in the blank page. When Allied intelligence finally uncovered the fragments of Project Fenris, they saw a technical dead end. They interviewed Major Hess, who vehemently blamed the defeatist engineers, and they interviewed the logistics officers, who confirmed the material shortages. The Allied report filed on the project was clinical. Fenris Thor's hammer, theoretical potential high, engineering execution poor. Project failure attributed to insurmountable material scarcity in late-war Germany. The report concluded that the failure was a consequence of Nazi hubris and logistics collapse, a testament to the effectiveness of the Allied blockade and bombing campaign. None of the intelligence officers, none of the historians, and none of the victorious Allied governments ever knew that behind the pages of meticulously forged data stood 2 men who risked their lives to make sure that the terrifying machine never worked. Klaus and Elias had succeeded so perfectly that their sabotage was invisible. Their names were not on monuments. They received no medals. They were not celebrated in any history book. Their heroism was a secret known only to the 2 of them, and that knowledge was their true reward and their lifelong shadow. They were the forgotten heroes in lab coats, the men who used complex math and simple material substitutions to defeat one of the Reich's most terrifying ideas, proving that sometimes, the greatest act of courage is not to build, but to perfectly, strategically, and invisibly fail.